Hi guys, today we'll delve into the case of a girl who disappeared from her bedroom in the middle of the night. Her sister, who shared the bed with her, told her something very strange, that a person in a wizard hat took her. This case remained unsolved for a whopping 35 years, but in 2024, the truth finally came to light. Jessica Gutierrez was born on December 3, 1981 in South Carolina. She was the youngest in her family, with 2 sisters and a brother. Shortly after her birth, Jessica's parents divorced, leaving her mom Debbie to raise 4 children on her own. They all lived in a small town called Edmond near the state capital. It was hard for Debbie to provide for all the children without any support. But despite this, the family were pretty close-knit. When Debbie was working, the older kids looked after Jessica, and when she had free time, Debbie tried to come up with something fun to do for all of them. On June 5, 1986, their family was spending a typical summer day. Jessica, who was 4 at the time, was playing in the yard with her siblings while their mom finished up some jobs around the house. In the evening, they all had dinner together and Debbie put the children to bed. Jessica usually slept with her mom on the same bed since she was the youngest, but on that particular day, her brother had an earache. So Debbie decided to let him sleep with her. As a result, Jessica went to sleep with her older sisters. The eldest slept on a separate bed and the other lay with Jessica. The next morning, Debbie woke up around 9 a.m. 6-year-old Rebecca, who slept in the same bed as Jessica, went into her mother's room and asked her to make cereal for breakfast. Debbie got out of bed, left her room, and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The front door, which she always locked before going to bed, was wide open and their dog, who usually stayed outside, was running around the house. There was also a curtain rod laying under the back window, and the protective screen had been removed from it. Debbie went into the girls' room, but Jessica was nowhere to be found. She also noticed some papers scattered on the floor. When she asked her older daughters where their sister was, Rebecca replied, "She's gone. A man with a beard and a magic hat took her." Thinking her 6-year-old daughter was just joking, the mother went to look for Jessica. She thought maybe her daughter had gone out to play in the yard, but she wasn't there. Debbie searched the entire house, hoping Jessica was just playing hide and seek. But pretty soon, she realized that Jessica was not in the house. So the mother ran back to the girls' room and began demanding Rebecca to tell where her sister was. The girl kept repeating the same thing about the man in the magic hat, and Debbie started to lose her temper. She began shouting and asking why Rebecca hadn't screamed for help. Someone was taking her younger sister from the house. After that, finally told more details of what had happened. According to her, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw a man with a beard and in a wizard hat next to their bed. He gently picked up Jessica, who was still sleeping, and left the room with her. Rebecca, who was only 6, didn't fully understand what was happening. She was scared and covered her head with a blanket, thinking it was just a weird dream. After lying like that for a while, she fell asleep and didn't even think to tell her mom what had happened in the morning. Realizing that Rebecca was likely telling the truth, Debbie immediately called the police. Officers searched the entire house and came to the conclusion that she could indeed have been abducted. Most likely, the perpetrator entered the house through the living room window by removing the protective screen. Upon closer inspection of the area, they discovered a fingerprint on the exterior of the glass and handed its image to experts. Next to the window, the police found a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts. Understanding that they were likely dealing with a kidnapping, investigators installed a recording device on Debbie's phone. This was done in case the kidnapper would call with a ransom demand. The police listened to Rebecca's account, and she told them the same story about the man in a wizard hat. This time, she added that he had unplugged the fan and nightlight before approaching their bed. The girl hadn't seen the kidnapper's face, so her description didn't offer any help to the investigators. They focused on Debbie and brought her to the station, where they asked her to recount all the events of the previous day in the utmost detail. During the conversation, she mentioned that she had a strong guess who might have taken her daughter. Just a few days before, she had ended a relationship with a man she had been dating for several months. According to Debbie, he was quite aggressive and controlling, and he also drank pretty often. The man wasn't happy with Debbie's decision to end their relationship, so she thought he might have decided to take revenge by taking her daughter. She called him from the police station, but he denied any involvement in Jessica's disappearance. The police decided to investigate him further, but found no evidence linking him to the crime. They also checked Jessica's father, but he had long been living out of state and just couldn't have abducted his daughter. Meanwhile, experts ran the fingerprints found on the window through the FBI database, but there were no matches. The police decided to focus on search efforts and began combing the area around Jessica's house. It was located on the outskirts, with endless fields stretching for many miles around it. Police searched abandoned buildings, forests, streams, and rivers, as well as any other places where Jessica could potentially be. The next day, the FBI joined the investigation, but they still couldn't find any traces of the missing girl. Police started distributing flyers not only in nearby towns, but throughout the entire state. The sheriff also sent an airplane to survey the area from the air. The search continued for several days, and during this time was restless. With 3 children to care for, she was unable to go out and search for her daughter. The police rarely spoke with her, only responding when she reached out to them herself. On Saturday, 2 days after Jessica's disappearance, Debbie decided to call the sheriff and ask whether they would continue the search over the weekend. She was understandably beside herself with grief, and the conversation became quite tense. Debbie accused the sheriff of negligence and lack of interest in finding Jessica. The sheriff responded that he had been searching for her daughter all night and warned that if she persisted in accusing him, he would call off his team and they would all simply forget about this case. Since Debbie's phone still recorded everything, she saved this recording. The woman continued to believe that the police were not doing enough to find her daughter, so she was losing more and more hope of finding Jessica alive with each passing day. This went on for several months, until there was a rather unexpected twist in the case. 10 weeks after Jessica's disappearance, the police faced a series of crimes. A local man had broken into someone's house, but the owner used a weapon to scare him off. Then, this man stole a van and drove to North Carolina, where he broke into a home of a sleeping woman and assaulted her. Shortly after this incident, the man was arrested and his fingerprints were entered into the database. Once they were there, investigators got a full match. His fingerprints matched those left on the window in Jessica's house. The man was a 27-year-old Thomas McDowell, and as soon as Debbie learned about this, she immediately told the police. She knew this person. She had met Thomas through relatives, and just a few months before Jessica's disappearance, she had hired him to do some work on their property. Over the course of 2 days spent at her house, he had built a shed and repaired the awning over the porch. Another curious fact was that Thomas had a beard and always wore a tall cowboy hat. This led to the thought that Rebecca, who only briefly saw the abductor in the darkness, might have mistaken this headgear for a wizard's hat, similar to those she'd seen in cartoons. But there was one huge problem for the investigators. Despite the fingerprint match, they deemed this evidence insufficient to press charges. They still didn't have Jessica's body, so they couldn't be 100% sure she was not alive. The presence of Thomas's fingerprints on the window could also have an explanation unrelated to the abduction. Since he worked on Debbie's property for 2 days, the fingerprint could have been left during that time, although such a possibility was quite unlikely. During the inspection of the house, forensic experts noted that the fingerprint appeared fresh. It hadn't been exposed to external factors, such as weather, which could have visually altered it. Debbie also regularly cleaned this window where the fingerprint was found. When her children played in the yard and wanted to say something to her, would run up to this open window, lean on it with their hands and shout. Given that the children's hands were almost always dirty, Debbie had to constantly clean the glass. Thomas had been working on her property around 6 months before the abduction, and there were no other fingerprints found there at the time of the investigation. This indicated that the man almost certainly could not have left the fingerprint back then, or else it would have been wiped out. Debbie also added another interesting fact. She remembered that when Thomas worked on her property, she accidentally locked herself out of the house, leaving the keys inside. As a result, she had to climb through the same window, and Thomas saw her doing it. But all these facts didn't convince the police. They continued to believe that there wasn't enough evidence against Thomas to press charges. In 1987, he was convicted of assaulting the woman whose home he broke into and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Debbie was shattered by the fact that the police refused to charge him with the abduction, but there was nothing she could do about it. That same year, something else happened. Thomas's cellmate contacted the police and told them that Thomas had confessed to him about committing the crime. According to Thomas, he abducted a girl in South Carolina from her own bedroom to assault her. While he was committing this horrible act, the victim bit him, and in a fit of rage, he killed her. Thomas dismembered the remains, took them to a field, and left them there. Investigators in Jessica's case went to prison to speak with him, and Thomas didn't even bother to deny it. Nevertheless, he said he was willing to confess if they provide him with full immunity. The authorities obviously couldn't agree to such terms, so the police once again came up empty-handed. Learning that Thomas had escaped punishment, his cellmate wrote a letter to Debbie and told her this story. Once again, she was shocked by the fact that Thomas was allowed to evade justice, but there was nothing she could do about it. Frustrated by the police's lack of action, Debbie decided to conduct her own investigation. At one point, she located an abandoned car that had previously belonged to Thomas and inspected it. There, on one of the seats, she noticed threads and fabric fibers that matched the color of Jessica's pajamas, the ones she wore the night of her disappearance. But the police didn't rush to pursue this lead. The fact that Debbie, without any special equipment or knowledge of forensic science, found fabric particles in some car seemed strange to them. In 1987, something else happened. Police from Kansas contacted local investigators and reported that they found a girl fitting Jessica's description. Her mother immediately flew there, but her hopes were instantly shattered. When she came to see the girl, just hearing her voice from the corridor was enough for her to realize it wasn't her daughter. Over the following years, Debbie gave several interviews where she accused the police of ignoring the obvious suspect, but it didn't yield any significant results. In 1990, Jessica's case was featured on a popular television program about unsolved crimes. This led to a new wave of tips, but unfortunately, they all turned out to be dead ends. A year later, Jessica became the first missing child of South Carolina for whom an age progress portrait was created. Considering it was the early 90s, such technology was quite new and experimental, but detectives hoped it could help identify Jessica all these years later. Unfortunately, despite all this, the case remained unsolved for many years. In 2007, 21 years after Jessica's disappearance, her mother once again publicly accused the local police department of inaction. This time, she gave reporters the recording of her conversation with the sheriff where he told her he could call his men off and forget about this case. They reached out to the sheriff, but he stated that he hadn't stopped investigating the case all these years. The sheriff also said that after this conversation with Debbie, he not only didn't send his men home, assigned even more officers to the investigation. Debbie also complained that for years she had been trying to get other agencies involved in this case, but each time the local prosecutor's office blocked these attempts. In the same year, 2007, they reviewed the case and confirmed that they didn't have any sufficient evidence, making it impossible to press charges against anyone at that time. In 2014, the sheriff faced charges related to fraud and bribery, leading to his dismissal and a 12-month jail sentence. 2 years later, the prosecutor was arrested for a hit-and-run while drunk, resulting in a $1,000 fine and his resignation. In 2021, after 35 years since Jessica's disappearance, the new sheriff named Jay Kuhn reopened the investigation with the FBI's help. 50 agents were assigned to this case, revisiting all available evidence and seeking new leads. Eventually, not only concluded that there is enough evidence against Thomas McDowell, but also discovered new, indirect pieces of evidence linking him to the crime. His relatives and friends revealed that the man drastically changed his appearance after Jessica's disappearance, shaving his beard and long hair and ditching his favorite cowboy hat. They also said that he smoked the same brand of cigarettes found near Jessica's home. Unfortunately, experts couldn't find any traces of DNA on these pieces of evidence, probably due to the fact that they've been tested multiple times in the past, which might have wiped out any biological traces. While all these factors added to suspicion against Thomas, the key evidence remained his fingerprint and the testimony of his former cellmate. Eventually, detectives believed that they had enough evidence to bring the case to trial, and in January 2022, Thomas was finally arrested. At 62 years old, Thomas refused to admit guilt, and preparation for the trial stretched for several years. It began only in January 2024, and Thomas's lawyers attempted to challenge the existing evidence. They argued that the fingerprint on the glass was left when Thomas had worked on the property. The defense also tried to use Rebecca's testimony. As we recall, Jessica's sister said that she saw a man in a wizard hat. Thomas's lawyers tried to convince everyone that the girl couldn't have mistaken a cowboy hat for a wizard's, as they are completely different. However, experts brought in by the prosecution pointed out that the fingerprint was clearly fresh. If it had been left a few months before the abduction, it would have either been erased or altered by the weather. During the trial, a former inmate also testified, repeating Thomas's confession made in prison in 1987. The prosecution pointed out that an outsider from another state would unlikely know the details of the case. Moreover, in those years, Thomas himself said he was willing to confess but asked for full immunity, which was obviously not an option. The trial ended on February 8, and the jury unanimously found Thomas guilty. At 63 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison. For Debbie, who had been convinced of his guilt from the early years of the investigation, the outcome of this case stirred conflicting emotions. She was glad that the perpetrator was finally held accountable, but said that Thomas could have been arrested 36 years ago. Instead, the police allowed him to live a long life before facing justice. Debbie also still couldn't come to terms with the fact that her daughter's remains were never found all these years. She, along with the new sheriff, refuses to give up and will continue the search, but the chances of finding her daughter after almost 4 decades are quite low. Debbie Lynn Randall was born on August 21, 1962 in Marietta, Georgia. She grew up in a loving family with 2 older brothers. Sometime after Debbie's birth, her parents divorced, but her dad remained involved in their lives. A few years later, their mom married a man named Roy, and he became Debbie's stepfather. They all lived in a small apartment building in a quiet neighborhood near a military base. Debbie was a typical, cheerful kid who loved hanging out with friends and playing basketball. She also loved dolls. Debbie had a large collection and spent a lot of time playing with them. On January 13, 1972, when Debbie was 9 years old, she had dinner with her family. After that, her mom decided to send her to the laundromat, as she had done many times before. Debbie was supposed to keep an eye on the laundry while it washed, while someone else from the family would help her carry the clothes to the laundromat and back home. The laundromat was just a few hundred yards away from their home, right across the street, so her mom wasn't too worried about anything happening to her. Back then, it was quite common for parents to have their kids help with chores like laundry, and Debbie even made some friends with the other girls at the laundromat. On that day, her mom wanted to send Debbie's older brother along, but he wasn't feeling well, wanted to watch his favorite TV show. So, the mother asked her husband to take the laundry instead, and Debbie went along with him, grabbing a box of detergent on the way. Her stepdad dropped off the laundry, loaded it into 2 washing machines and left, while Debbie stayed to wait for the wash to finish. After that, she was supposed to walk home and ask someone to pick up the clean clothes as she couldn't carry them all by herself. Sometime later, Debbie's mom noticed that she still hadn't returned, even though the laundry should have been done by them. It was getting dark outside, so she and her husband decided to walk to the laundromat, but Debbie wasn't there. The employee told them that she had left a while ago and hadn't come back since. Her mom became worried and started to walk around the nearby streets with Roy searching for Debbie. Soon, they noticed something strange. A few dozen yards from the laundromat, the parking lot next to one of the cars, there was spilled detergent. Since Debbie was carrying the box of detergent, her mom immediately thought it might have belonged to her. They continued to search the parking lot and the surrounding area, but there were no other signs of Debbie. Some neighbors who knew the family well also joined in to help with the search, but all their efforts yielded no results, and Debbie's mom decided to contact the police. The officers examined the area of the parking lot where the detergent was spilled and noticed their first potential lead. The detergent was scattered just inches away from a parked car, and on its door they spotted several clear fingerprints. Those prints appeared fresh and were located significantly lower than the handle, which already seemed odd. The officers thought that at this exact spot an unknown perpetrator might have grabbed the girl and touched the car in the process. They collected these prints and handed them over to forensic experts, while also beginning to search for the owner of the vehicle to confirm if the prints didn't belong to them. With no other leads, the police started combing the streets, trying to find new clues or witnesses. The laundromat employee mentioned that she hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Debbie had been sitting and waiting for the laundry to finish, then took her box of detergent and left the building. Most likely, she headed home to ask someone to pick up the clothes. The police soon found the first witness whose account immediately changed the course of the investigation. 12-year-old Sandra, along with her friend, was walking to the same laundromat, helping her carry dirty clothes. Suddenly, they saw a man grabbing a girl in the middle of the street and pulling her into his car, parked nearby the laundromat. The girl was screaming and trying to break free, but he slammed the door shut, got behind the wheel, and drove off. The man nearly hit Sandra and her friend. One of the girls started shouting after him, but he sped away. At the time, Sandra didn't realize she had witnessed an abduction. She thought the man was the girl's father or some other relative picking her up, while she wanted to stay out longer. Because of this, Sandra didn't tell any adults about what happened or report it to the police. Now, when she learned about Debbie's abduction, she provided investigators with crucial information. Based on her description, the perpetrator drove a dark pickup truck, likely a 1957 model according to her description. She described the man as young, white, with thick, dark hair. He wore a white t-shirt, jeans, and black work boots. Another girl who lived in the same building as Debbie also shared her observations. That evening, she was standing outside her apartment when a dark pickup truck drove past the building. At first, she thought it was her uncle behind the wheel. When the driver stopped right in front of her and looked at the girl, she realized it wasn't him. According to her description, it was a white man with medium-length dark hair. She also provided investigators with a few more details about his appearance that she could remember. The girl mentioned that this man parked near their building, next to the same car where the spilled detergent would later be found. The police soon found another witness. A man who lived near Debbie's house was driving to the hospital to visit his wife. At one point, a dark pickup truck, likely a Dodge, nearly crashed into him before driving off recklessly. The driver appeared to be around 30 years old with dark hair. However, the most crucial detail was that the witness also saw a girl in his car, seemingly attempting to escape while the driver held her with one hand. After listening to all these accounts, the police had no doubt that Debbie had been abducted. They distributed information about the suspect's vehicle to all patrol units, and police artists created a sketch based on the testimonies of the three witnesses. While some officers were searching for similar vehicles and checking their owners, others organized extensive searches for Debbie. With each day, more volunteers and police officers from other towns joined in. In total, around 4,000 people were involved in the search, setting a record not only for the city but for the entire state. Detectives also investigated various people who knew Debbie, including all male neighbors, her stepfather, and her biological father, but all of them were ruled out as suspects. Her father, who lived in the same city, learned about his daughter's disappearance at work and immediately joined the search efforts. Detectives checked previously convicted criminals living within a few-mile radius of Debbie's home, but they didn't find any suitable suspects among them. The extensive search efforts continued for over 2 weeks without yielding any results. This went on until January 29th when several students joined the search teams and were sent to explore the wooded area several miles from Debbie's house. After spending nearly 5 hours there, one of them suddenly noticed tracks on the ground leading from the trail into the depths of the forest, as if something had been dragged there. Following the tracks deeper into the woods for about 150 feet, they stumbled upon a human body and immediately called the officers. They quickly realized that they had found Debbie Randall. She was wearing the same clothes described by her mother on the day of her abduction, a lavender dress and a dark blue zip-up jacket with a hood. However, her shoes were missing. She had socks on, but her lavender shoes were nowhere to be found. She had received these shoes as a Christmas gift just a few weeks before her disappearance, and she loved them very much. Her body was handed over to medical experts, who determined that she had died from strangulation. The victim had also been sexually assaulted. Experts found a single dark hair on her body, most likely belonging to the killer. Since DNA analysis was not used at that time, experts couldn't do much with this evidence. They examined it under a microscope and, based on their knowledge at the time, concluded that it belonged to a man aged between 18 and 30 years old. Debbie's clothing was also covered in dirt, and lacking other leads, detectives decided to examine it more thoroughly. They contacted a geologist and asked him to work with their forensic team. Together, they determined that some of the dirt consisted of a particular type of clay mined less than 10 miles from their city. The geologist confirmed that it was indeed the unique northern Georgia clay that couldn't be found anywhere else nearby. There were also other dirt stains different from the first. They were traced back to another type of clay mined by a local company just 2 miles from where the body was discovered. Based on this information, detectives theorized that the perpetrator didn't kill the victim immediately. Instead, drove her to remote areas where those types of clay were located. Most likely, he initially took her out of town, where he sexually assaulted her. Then, he drove to the location where the second type of clay was mined, killed her, and took her to the forest, dragging her body behind the trees and leaving it there. Supporting this theory were not only the clay traces, but also the forensic analysis indicating that Debbie was already dead when brought to the forest. If the perpetrator had killed her there would have been signs of a struggle around that area. The traces on the ground from the trail into the trees also suggested that the victim was already dead. The clay mining sites were quite remote and difficult to access, leading detectives to speculate that the killer might have worked there. They reached out to the mining companies, and a supervisor for one of them confirmed this theory. It was hard to believe that someone unfamiliar with that area have taken the abducted girl there. Even the workers themselves sometimes struggled to navigate through these vast areas. Police checked employees from both companies, trying to find a man matching the description or the similar vehicle, but it didn't lead to anything. They also had fingerprints left on the car just inches away from the abduction site and compared them with all suspects, but this yielded no results either. The news of Debbie's brutal murder shook the entire city, and thousands of people came to bid farewell at her funeral. The local police department continued their efforts to find the killer and bring them to justice, but they couldn't find any new leads, hitting dead ends over and over again. Eventually, the case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives continued to work on it, checking dozens of suspects, but they couldn't establish their involvement. For the lead detective on the case, Morris Nix, Debbie's murder remained a priority throughout his entire career. The crime happened when he was just 19, and he had been involved in the search and investigation from day one. For many years, Nix pursued various leads, scrutinized different suspects, and eventually compiled a list of 4 men whom he considered the most likely suspects. When the FBI established a DNA database, experts were able to extract the genetic profile of the perpetrator from the hair found on Debbie's body. It was entered into the database, but no matches were found. This indicated that the killer either had never been convicted of other serious crimes or it occurred before the time when DNA samples started being collected from such individuals. In 2015, 43 years after the murder, the case was reopened and detectives decided to re-examine the victim's clothing using modern technology. It had been stored in the evidence warehouse all this time, and experts found biological material from an unknown man on it. However, over the years it had degraded significantly, resulting in a partial profile. In 2018, Debbie's mother, who had hoped for decades to see the police arrest her daughter's killer and hold him accountable, gave an interview. She said that after Debbie's murder, she couldn't bear to live in the apartment where everything reminded her of her loss. She moved to another city, and year after year, lack of progress in the investigation slowly destroyed her. She also said her only desire now is to see the closure of this case before her time comes. Unfortunately, that was not meant to happen. Just a few weeks after the interview, She passed away to cancer at the age of 78, and she was laid to rest next to her daughter. Sandra, who witnessed the abduction at the age of 12, also spoke out in an interview. She said that she had never stopped blaming herself over the years. According to Sandra, she believed she could have stopped the perpetrator and prevented the abduction, even if it meant taking Debbie's place and dying instead of her. In 2019, the local police department received additional funding, enabling them to request a more detailed analysis of Debbie's clothing. This time, experts were able to extract a full DNA sample from it. The perpetrator's DNA still wasn't in the FBI database. Debbie's father was also interviewed, and he shared that not a day had gone by over the decades when he didn't think about Debbie. He still kept a box of her old photos, hoping for only one thing: to reunite with his daughter in heaven. In 2022, shortly after the interview, he passed away. In the same year, detectives focused all their efforts on the one lead they had. DNA. They reached out to a company in Florida specializing on an innovative DNA analysis method called genetic genealogy. The police handed over all the biological samples they had collected over the years and waited. Experts created a profile of the unknown man and began searching for his relatives in public genetic databases. They needed to find people who had uploaded their DNA because family members' genetic material has similarities. Modern tools can detect even distant relatives. After examining thousands of potential relatives of the killer, investigators narrowed down their search to a family living in Marietta in 2023. They asked them to provide DNA samples, and they agreed. The analysis showed that the killer was indeed their close relative, so experts looked into their family more carefully. They soon identified the most likely owner of the killer's DNA sample, a man named William Rose. However, there was a problem. Rose had taken his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's murder. But detectives were determined to finally close this case no matter what. They obtained a warrant to exhume his grave, and experts took a direct DNA sample from his remains. After 51 years since Debbie's murder, the police finally got a full match. William Rose was indeed the killer. At the time of the murder, he was only 24 years old and had never been a suspect. It turned out that his relatives lived in the same building as Debbie's family. Rose regularly visited them, so investigators believe that he might have seen the girl on multiple occasions. Perhaps that evening he was headed to visit his relatives, but saw Debbie coming out of the laundromat and heading towards her home. Based on the testimonies of her neighbors and other witnesses, Rose pulled into the parking lot between the victim's house and the laundromat, left the engine running, got out, grabbed Debbie, and then drove north. Perhaps he immediately headed to the clay quarry, which was located in that direction. It's worth mentioning that Rose didn't have any other criminal record. Either he didn't commit anything serious besides Debbie's murder, or he simply didn't get caught. At the time the case was solved, the only living close relative of the victim was her older brother Melvin. He attended the press conference where they announced the discovery of the culprit and thanked everyone who had worked on his sister's case for over half a century. He also said he wished his mom could have lived to see this moment, but added that she was now in heaven with Debbie. Karen Snyder was born on July 29, 1948 in the small American town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She grew up in a very large family with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, Karen met a boy named Paul, and they decided to get married when she was just 17. Shortly after, Karen became pregnant, and in 1966, their daughter Paula was born. Even though Karen was only 18 at the time, she and her husband were ready and happy to start their own family. They moved to a town called Calumet, Illinois, where Paul's parents lived. The family settled on the same street as his parents, just a few houses away, allowing them to see Paul every day and spend a lot of time with their granddaughter. Calumet, with a population of about 25,000 residents, was located not far from Chicago and considered a very safe place to live. Karen spent most of her time taking care of their child while Paul got a job at the local railroad. On November 12, 1966, Paul went to his night shift around 2 p.m. A few hours later, he tried to call Karen, but she didn't answer. This was unusual because she was supposed to be at home and couldn't have left their 2-month-old daughter alone. Concerned, he called his parents, who lived just a few houses away, and asked them to check on Karen. They walked down the street and knocked on the door, but there was no response. His parents didn't have a spare key, so they continued knocking for a few minutes and then went back home to call their son. Paul became even more worried and decided to leave work early to check if everything was all right. As he approached the house, his concern grew even more. The porch light was off and the blinds were tightly closed. This was unusual because Karen always left the porch light on for him when he worked the night shift. Paul tried to open the door with his key and realized it was unlocked. He entered the living room and was relieved to find his 2-month-old daughter sleeping in a playpen near the working TV. However, Karen was nowhere to be seen, so he began calling out her name while checking each room. As Paul decided to go upstairs, he tried to turn on the staircase light, but the switch didn't work. He made his way to the bedroom and turned on a lamp, revealing a horrifying scene. The room was in disarray, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor lay Karen, showing no signs of life, and Paul immediately realized she was dead. Recovering from the shock, Paul went downstairs, called the police, and took his daughter outside. While he was waiting for the police and ambulance, his parents came out to the street and saw him crying and pleading for help. Paul's mother grabbed the flashlight and rushed into the house, hoping to help Karen. But as soon as she saw Karen's blood-covered body, she knew it was too late to save her. Soon after, the medics and police arrived. The doctors could only confirm Karen's death, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. On the back door lock, they found shallow scratches indicating an attempted break-in. However, the door was still locked, suggesting the intruder initially tried to enter this way but failed. Next, they discovered a broken basement window with a trail of blood leading from it to the front door. Investigators speculated that after failing to open the back door, the intruder tried to enter through the basement and cut themselves on the glass, evidenced by the blood on it. The fact that the intruder didn't enter through the basement but went to the front door suggests it was either unlocked or Karen opened it herself. In the living room, they found more blood, indicating that the attack likely started there, catching Karen near her daughter's crib. The blood trail continued from the living room, up the stairs, down the hallway, and into the couple's bedroom, where Karen's body was found. The bedroom was a chaotic scene, blood everywhere, and many items scattered and broken, indicating Karen fought back fiercely. There was a phone in the bedroom, but it had been ripped from the wall. Police believe Karen might have run there ahead of the intruder to call for help, but she couldn't. In those days, there wasn't a single emergency number like 911. Local police had their own number, so detectives thought she might have dialed incorrectly in her haste. Investigators also found a blood-covered light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed from the socket above the stairs. It seemed the intruder did this, though the reason was unclear. Perhaps he unscrewed it while following Karen upstairs, giving her a brief moment to try calling the police. In the downstairs bathroom, police discovered a pile of bloodied clothes and various items. Among them were a pair of pants, a bedsheet, and a washcloth. Detectives speculated that the killer used these items to wipe the blood off his hands and clothes. It appeared he also attempted to clean himself with the washcloth or possibly tried to use it to wipe blood off the floor to cover his tracks. However, given the amount of blood throughout the house, these efforts were clearly futile. After using these items, the killer threw them into the bathtub and fled the scene. This indicated to investigators that he remained in the house for some time after the murder, although they couldn't determine the exact period of time. Detectives began their investigation and quickly ruled out the possibility of a botched robbery. The only missing items were Karen's blue wallet, containing about $50, and one of the bedside lamps, which had no significant value. Medical examiners found 124 stab wounds on Karen's body, most concentrated in the chest area. Such brutality suggested the attacker had personal motives. Experts identified the likely weapon as a knife with a narrow blade, similar to a stiletto, but police couldn't find it inside the house or anywhere nearby. Karen was fully clothed and no signs of sexual assault were found, but investigators didn't rule out that the attacker might have had such a motive. but for some reason was unable to carry it out. The time of death was estimated between 4 and 6 p.m. Since Paul discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer must have left the house several hours earlier. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with the victim's relatives and friends. According to Paul's mother, Karen had mentioned being afraid to live in that house and said she wanted to move to Indiana where her parents lived. However, she didn't specify the reasons for her fear, and investigators couldn't find any more information. Karen's neighbors also provided an interesting observation. Their dog, which usually barked at the slightest noise, remained quiet that evening. With no other leads, the police turned their focus to Karen's husband, Paul. In such crimes, the spouse is often the primary suspect, so they began investigating him. After analyzing the evidence from the house, detectives concluded that the attempted break-in at the back door and the broken basement window might have been staged. The killer was likely someone familiar with Karen, but tried to make it appear as if a random intruder had committed the crime. This suggested that either Karen willingly opened the door to the killer or they had a key. Investigators began interrogating Paul, while also trying to establish whether he had the opportunity to commit the crime. They considered the possibility that he might have killed Karen before leaving for his evening shift, as he had left home after lunch that day. They also checked whether he remained at work for the entire shift or if he had left at any point. Paul denied any involvement in the murder, but the police continued to view him as the prime suspect. With almost no evidence, they attempted to obtain a confession from him, repeatedly calling him in for questioning. But despite this pressure, consistently maintained his innocence. Karen's funeral took place 6 days after the murder. Besides family and friends, detectives also attended the ceremony and soon noticed something weird. One of the pallbearers had a deep wound on his forehead and a bandaged hand. The police identified this man as James Barbier, a friend of both Paul and Karen. He worked with Paul at the railroad and had done some repairs in the house shortly before the murder. Karen knew James pretty well and might have opened the door for him. Investigators began looking into James and discovered that on the evening of the murder, he had gone to a local hospital with serious injuries to his hand and face, requiring stitches. This aligned with the evidence suggesting the killer injured himself on the broken basement window glass. James became the second suspect and detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, explaining his injuries by saying that he had been returning home drunk from a bar that evening, tripped over a stump in the dark and hurt himself on some splinters. James' wife confirmed that he came home that night drunk, with a bandaged hand and a cut on his forehead. She mentioned that he was acting weird and was visibly shaken, but she added that James was an alcoholic and frequently got heavily drunk, so this behavior wasn't unusual. When police interviewed individuals who frequented bars in Karen's neighborhood, they found witnesses who had seen James there that day. However, they couldn't pinpoint the exact times he was present. When experts finished analyzing the evidence from Karen's house, they found something intriguing. As suspected, there were 2 different types of blood. One matched Karen's blood type while the other belonged to a different blood type, the same as James's. Although this blood type match was not proof of James's, detectives decided to arrest him, hoping he would confess. They also cleared Karen's husband of suspicion, as none of the blood samples matched his type. James continued to deny his involvement, insisting that his injuries were from his fall. The police hoped forensic experts might find some additional evidence. They faced disappointment. The fingerprints collected from the crime scene were smudged, and without DNA analysis, they couldn't make any progress with the blood evidence. Eventually, they had to release James and continued searching for new leads. Since then, investigators have looked into several other suspects and interviewed dozens of people, but the case remained unsolved for many years. Karen's murder forever changed their small town. Once considered safe, residents remembered the brutal crime for a long time and wondered who could have committed it. At the time, police did not reveal the identities of the suspects, including James, so only Karen's relatives and close friends knew of his potential involvement. In later interviews with reporters, they said they truly believed James was guilty, but without solid evidence, proving his involvement was simply impossible. Karen's father passed away in 1973, 7 years after the tragedy, and her mother died in 1977. Neither of them ever found out who killed their daughter. Paul eventually remarried, and his second wife helped raise Paula, essentially becoming the mother the girl never had the chance to remember. Her relatives decided not to tell her how her biological mother died, trying to shield the girl from the horrific details. Paula later recalled that when she started school, other kids teased her simply because her mother was dead. A few years later, understanding that she might hear the truth from others or come across news reports, her relatives finally told her what had happened to Karen. In 1989, at the age of 45, Paul passed away from health problems, never learning the truth either. For decades, there was no progress on the case. Paula occasionally gave interviews to journalists expressing her hope to bring the culprit to justice and mentioning that she regularly contacted the local police department to ask about any new developments. But they always replied that there were no new leads and the case remained unsolved for many years. This continued until the end of 2022 when one day the police received a call. A 29-year-old man contacted the police department responsible for Karen's case, inquiring about any new developments. The man explained that he had known about this crime his whole life, as his grandmother talked about it since he was a kid. It turned out they were distant relatives of Karen's family, and the man was curious whether the police had made any progress in solving the mystery. He said that he had been reading newspaper clippings about the case at work, and wondered if there were any modern technologies that could help solve it. And this prompted him to reach out to the police. To his surprise, the police department decided to reopen the investigation following his call. Naturally, none of the original detectives were still around, so a new team began reviewing all the available materials from scratch. They discovered that almost all the evidence except the blood samples collected from the floor had not only been preserved, but was also well maintained over the past 56 years. This included Karen's clothing and various items from her home. The detectives sent all the remaining evidence to the lab, where experts began examining each item with modern tools. Meanwhile, the police re-interviewed everyone connected to the case who was still alive. 16 months after the investigation was reopened, detectives received a long-awaited call from the lab. Experts had found several drops of blood on Karen's dress and extracted a DNA profile of an unknown male. The police immediately obtained a warrant from a judge to collect a genetic sample from the main suspect, James, who was still alive. They quickly got his sample, sent it to the lab, and soon received confirmation. James' DNA matched the blood found on Karen's dress. This confirmed that James was just 21 years old at the time of Karen's death, had been in her home the day she was murdered, and had initially lied about how he got his injuries. On April 29, 2024, the police returned to James' home and the 79-year-old man was finally arrested for murder. Upon being informed of the DNA match, James did not deny anything and confessed to the crime. While the police have not yet disclosed all details of his interrogation due to the ongoing legal proceedings, James admitted that he had known his entire life that he would eventually be caught. James has been charged with first-degree murder and was released on bail due to his age and severe health conditions. Given James' estate, the risk of him fleeing was considered nearly non-existent. However, Karen's relatives were upset because they had already suffered enough seeing the killer live freely for over 50 years. As for the motive, it remains unknown. The first hearing took place at the end of May, and more details are expected to be revealed only after the trial. According to the main theory reported by journalists, James had feelings for Karen and was jealous of her husband since she married him. Additionally, James was indeed heavily intoxicated that evening, which may have driven him to commit the crime. Karen's relatives expressed their gratitude to the detectives for finally bringing James to justice. However, given his health issues, even if James lives to see prison, he is unlikely to spend much time there. Karen's daughter, who was 57 at the time of James' arrest, said she received the best call of her life when she learned that her mother's killer had finally been caught. She admitted she had lost hope, and was surprised that the evidence had been so well preserved. She also revealed that she blames James for her father's early death. Beyond dealing with the brutal murder of his wife, her father had spent the rest of his life almost certain that his close friend was responsible, and it was very hard for him to see James continue to live freely. Melissa Tremblay was born on March 1, 1977 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. When she was just a month old, her biological parents gave her up for adoption, and she was adopted by Jeanette and Robert Tremblay. Melissa grew up in the nearby town of Salem, New Hampshire. She was a very energetic child who loved fashion, singing, and had a passion for reading from a young age. Melissa had many friends at school, spent a lot of time at the Boys and Girls Club of America. When she was 9, her adoptive parents divorced, and her father hasn't been involved in her life since. Sometime later, her mother started dating another man named Robert, but he didn't live with them. On September 11, 1988, when she was 11, her mother took Melissa to Lawrence, where she was supposed to meet Robert. They often spent time at a local bar, and Jeanette frequently took Melissa along, because she had no one to leave her with. Usually, her mom would let Melissa play outside since she got bored sitting with them. Jeanette always told her not to go far, so Melissa spent time on the nearby streets. Because her mom went to this bar quite often, Melissa made friends with other kids in the area and would occasionally play with them. That day, Melissa spent most of her time outside, checking in with her mother now and then. During one of these visits, the bartender made her some popcorn. Melissa said she'd come back for it soon and left, but she never returned to the bar. Around 4 p.m., her mother started to worry since Melissa had been gone for a while. She went outside and checked her car, but Melissa was nowhere to be found. She and Robert began searching for her, going street by street, but they couldn't find Melissa. They searched the area for several hours, and around 9 p.m., Jeanette decided to call the police. Officers immediately joined the search, but they also couldn't find any traces of her. By then, it was already dark. It made their task much more difficult, but the police continued searching for Melissa late into the night. They also considered the possibility that she might have run away, but her mother insisted that Melissa was afraid of the dark and didn't like being alone, so she would never have run off. The next day, Melissa's whereabouts were still unknown. The search continued. This went on until about 3 p.m. when a railroad worker called the police. He had been conducting a routine inspection of an old rail yard just a few hundred yards from the bar. The yard was quite large, with up to 8 tracks in its widest section, although some of them hadn't been used in a long time. There were a lot of empty boxcars, and between 2 of them the worker noticed something unusual. When he got closer, he realized it was a human body and immediately called the police. Detectives arrived at the scene and quickly identified the body as Melissa Tremblay. Aside from the fact that she had been reported missing since the previous morning, there was a card with her name from the Boys and Girls Club in a purse found near the body. Melissa's body was lying on tracks that were still in use and one of her legs had been severed. The detectives believe this likely happened due to a passing train, since the section of track was still active. However, they immediately doubted that this was the cause of death. The lead detective noticed several details that contradicted this theory. Melissa's purse, containing the card with her name, was found almost 20 yards from the body. This seemed strange, as it was unlikely that a train accident could have thrown the purse so far. The detective also noticed a large number of footprints and drops of blood near the purse. This led him to suspect that Melissa might have been attacked there, and only then her body was moved to the tracks. The assailant might have hoped to make it look like she died in a train accident. Another factor pointing to foul play was the location itself. The old rail yard, with its numerous empty boxcars, was a known hangout for homeless individuals and those looking for secluded spots to use illegal substances. So the detectives considered the possibility that some of them might have attacked Melissa. Her body was sent to medical examiners while the police began searching for clues. Since no useful evidence was found at the scene where Melissa was discovered, investigators focused on finding witnesses to piece together the timeline of events. First, they spoke with an employee of the railroad company. He mentioned that the day before the body was found, he saw a girl fitting Melissa's description near the tracks. He told her to leave immediately, because it was unsafe for children to be there, and she left the area. Next, the police found a woman living not far from the bar. She said she had known Melissa for several months because her children had become friends with Melissa, and she often visited their house. On that day, Melissa had come over to invite her children to play, but the woman told her they were grounded and couldn't go out, so Melissa left alone. Investigators soon found another witness who provided the first significant lead. He reported seeing a girl resembling Melissa standing next to a van at an intersection near the rail yard, talking to the driver. The witness described this man as rather large, unkempt, around 30 years old, with dark hair and a large beard. The van was brown, old, and rusty. The police considered that this man might be connected to the murder, and started searching for similar vehicles. Meanwhile, the medical examiners finished their report and confirmed that the train was not the cause of death. Melissa's body had numerous bruises and 3 fatal stab wounds. No signs of full assault were found, and there were no foreign biological samples on her body or clothing. The experts determined that the stab wounds were inflicted with the left hand, suggesting that the perpetrator was likely left-handed. The case was reclassified as a homicide and detectives focused on finding the killer. However, they still had only one lead, the description of the van seen near Melissa shortly before she disappeared. The police concentrated on finding similar vehicles in the area but repeatedly hit dead ends. The challenge was that even if they found the right van, linking its owner to the murder would be nearly impossible without a confession. DNA analysis was not yet in use, and there were no additional pieces of evidence, like Melissa's belongings or fingerprints, likely to be found in the van. The police also kept trying to find new witnesses. They interviewed several hundred residents in the area, but this effort yielded no results. Detectives continued searching for the van and other clues for several months, but the case eventually went cold. Melissa's murder received significant media coverage, and many people began blaming her mother for what happened. They were outraged that Jeanette let her 11-year-old daughter wander the streets alone, especially near such a dangerous place as a rail yard. What infuriated them even more was that while Melissa roamed the streets for hours unattended, her mother was drinking in a bar. Rumors began spreading in the newspapers that Jeanette had developed a drinking problem after her divorce and was struggling with her parental responsibilities. People also started blaming social services for failing Melissa by not intervening in the situation. Amid all these accusations, Jeanette refused to speak with media or answer their questions. When reporters reached out to Child Protective Services, they stated they were aware of the family's complicated situation and had tried to take some measures, but revoking Jeanette's parental rights had never been considered. Since then, there had been no progress in the case. Police repeatedly reviewed it and examined potential suspects, but this yielded no results. In 2000, 12 years after the murder, investigators identified their first potential suspect, Tommy Lynn Sells. He confessed to 22 murders, and investigators in Melissa's case found that many details of his crime closely matched those of her murder. Moreover, Tommy resembled the van driver seen with the girl, and he often spent nights in empty boxcars while traveling across various states. Detectives began investigating his possible involvement in Melissa's murder, but they eventually concluded that he was unlikely to be responsible. They couldn't find any evidence placing Tommy near Lawrence at that time. Instead, they determined he was probably in another state. The case remained cold for several more years until 2013, when detectives unexpectedly obtained a new lead. They arrested a man from Lawrence for an unrelated case, and during questioning, he suddenly claimed to know some details about Melissa Tremblay's murder. The man said that in 1988, when he was just 13, he used to steal cars for a living. He spent a lot of time on the streets looking for suitable vehicles, and on the day Melissa disappeared, he saw a girl resembling her. She was sitting on the steps of that same bar, and next to her was a man named Mike. The witness knew Mike, but his family had warned him to stay away from that man because of his questionable reputation. The boy walked past them, and about 10 minutes later, on his way back, he saw the girl leaving the bar with Mike. At some point, another man, whom the witness didn't recognize, approached them, and the three of them continued walking together. The police asked the witness why he had remained silent for 25 years. He replied that at the time he didn't want any unnecessary contact with the police. However, when he learned about Melissa's murder and realized he might have seen her, he asked his brother if he should tell someone, but he advised him to stay quiet. However, the detectives immediately found a serious contradiction in the story. According to the witness, He saw the girl on the bar steps when it was already dark outside. But Melissa was reported missing around 4 p.m. when it was still daylight. Given that all the bar patrons and staff were aware of her disappearance and her mother had been searching for her for hours, the detectives found it highly unlikely that Melissa could have been right outside the bar without being noticed. The police considered the possibility that the witness had either seen a different girl. His account was inaccurate. Despite this, they investigated Mike for potential involvement but made no progress. Nevertheless, the witness's story brought renewed attention to the old case, and in 2014 it was reopened. By then, DNA analysis was widely used, and the police hoped that experts could find some new clues by re-examining all the available evidence. They examined Melissa's clothing and other items but found no foreign DNA. However, there was something else among the evidence. Samples taken from under Melissa's nails collected in case she had scratched her attacker. The experts analyzed these samples and indeed found traces of foreign skin, which were promptly sent to the lab. But there was a new problem. Experts were able to extract a DNA profile of an unknown male, but was only partial. It wasn't enough to get a match in the database, but the investigators were determined not to give up. Sometime later, they reached out to a company specializing in genetic genealogy. The company analyzed the sample and began searching for potential matches in available databases. This was a challenging task because they had to work with a partial profile, which made it impossible to identify the person with absolute certainty. Nevertheless, through meticulous work, they managed to find a possible distant relative of the sample's owner in the databases. This led them to a specific family with the last name, McClendon. Detectives began investigating the members of this family, trying to determine who might have committed the crime. This process took several years due to the primary challenge, the lack of a complete DNA profile, to definitively prove the guilt of any family member. Therefore, investigators carefully examined who among them could have been in Lawrence in 1988, matched all the criteria like age and so on. Eventually, they focused on two brothers, one of whom was Marvin McClendon. Marvin lived in Alabama, but investigators discovered that in the late 80s, he lived just 20 minutes away from Lawrence and worked as a carpenter. Digging into Marvin's past, they learned that he frequently visited a church located just a few hundred yards from the bar where Melissa was last seen. Marvin had also worked as a prison guard for about 30 years, but with breaks, one of which occurred in 1988. The intriguing findings didn't stop there. Police found that Marvin owned an old brown van during those years, which he used for work. Despite this, Marvin had no criminal record. Aside from numerous traffic fines for not wearing a seatbelt, he had been married twice, but both wives had left him. He had 2 sons from his first marriage, but was not actively involved in their lives. Finally, Marvin was left-handed, unlike all his close male relatives. While detectives were investigating this suspect, Melissa's mother passed away in 2015 at the age of 70. She had struggled with a severe illness for a long time and never found out who killed her daughter. After gathering all the information on Marvin and checking his other relatives, detectives concluded that he was the most likely perpetrator. In 2021, they went to Alabama to question him about that time in the late 80s. Eventually, they brought up the murder of Melissa Tremblay, and Marvin claimed he had nothing to do with it. When told that DNA from one of his close relatives was found on the victim, Marvin suggested that the killer might be his brother. That same year, Marvin voluntarily provided his DNA sample, but experts still couldn't establish a complete match. The partial profile from under Melissa's nails only indicated that Marvin was either closely related to the killer or was the killer himself. However, investigators who had already examined all his close male relatives knew that none of them could have committed the crime, leaving Marvin as the prime suspect. They also understood that without a full DNA match, it would be extremely challenging for the prosecution to secure a conviction. As a result, they spent another year trying to find any additional clues. Detectives also checked Mike, the man whom the 13-year-old boy claimed to have seen with a girl resembling Melissa on the bar steps. After obtaining his DNA sample, experts determined that it didn't match the skin particles found under the victim's nails, ruling him out as suspect. They visited Marvin several times, asking him various questions, and in April 2022, they finally decided to arrest him. Despite his continued claims of innocence, Marvin allegedly made a suspicious remark during his arrest. He told one of the officers, "At least I got to enjoy 20 years of my pension." Marvin, who was 74 years old at the time, was sent to jail awaiting trial. The judge had to place him under constant protection because other inmates quickly learned about his charges and the fact that he had worked as a prison guard. Without conclusive evidence, the prosecution relied on a process of elimination. DNA from someone in Marvin's family was found under the victim's nails, but none of his close relatives had the opportunity to commit the crime. As for distant relatives, a match with their DNA would be less evident and experts could easily see the difference. They also pointed out that in 1988, Marvin frequently visited a church on the same street as the bar, owned a similar van, and matched the description given by a witness who saw a girl near his vehicle. The trial began in December 2022. Marvin's lawyer immediately focused on the lack of a complete DNA profile of the perpetrator, claiming that without it, his client's guilt couldn't be confirmed. The defense then called two experts. One was a forensic specialist who testified that, based on crime scene photos, she couldn't confirm that the killer was indeed left-handed. The other was a genetics expert who argued that a partial DNA match with one family doesn't rule out the possibility of it belonging to distant relatives, as any person can have hundreds or thousands of them. Marvin declined to testify in his defense, and by the end of December, the jury began their deliberations. It took them almost a week, and December 27th, they reported being unable to reach a unanimous decision. Some jurors felt that without a complete DNA profile, they couldn't definitively convict Marvin, leading the judge to declare a mistrial. In early 2024, the prosecution announced plans for a retrial set to begin on September 30th, 2024. Until then, Marvin will remain in jail. Considering that he is 76 years old now, and from multiple health issues, there is a possibility he might not survive until the end of the new trial. If the court fails to convict him again, Marvin could be released, leaving Melissa's murder unresolved, and we may never learn the truth. Tanya van Cuylenborg was born on March 7, 1969 in Victoria, Canada. She had loving parents and an older brother she was very close to. From a young age, Tanya loved animals and even considered becoming a veterinarian someday. She also wanted to travel and explore the world. In high school, she went to Paris with her best friend, and that trip made her dream of traveling even stronger. Shortly before graduating high school, when she was 18, Tanya met a boy named Jay Cook. They went to the same school, but Jay was 2 years older. They met through a mutual friend after he had graduated, and soon they began dating. Even though Tanya wanted to be a veterinarian, she decided to take some time before going to college so she could travel. After finishing high school, she got a job at a cafe to save money for these plans, and she also worked as a dog walker. Jay also didn't go to college after high school. Instead, he helped his father with their small family business installing heating systems. In November 1987, Jay's father received an order, but the local suppliers didn't have one of the key parts in stock. The nearest place to buy it was Seattle in Washington state. Jay's father decided it would be quicker and cheaper to get the part himself, rather than order it for delivery. However, he was swamped with work and knew he couldn't fit the trip into his schedule. So, he asked his son to go to Seattle instead of him, and Jay agreed. Jay wanted to help his father with the business, but he was also excited for another reason. He decided to invite Tanya, knowing she would likely enjoy the trip. At that time, they had been dating for about 6 months, but their relationship wasn't very serious. Jay hoped that the trip would change that and bring them closer. As he expected, Tanya agreed right away. They planned to leave Victoria in the morning, reach Seattle by evening, and returned the next day. Jay's father gave him his van and money to book a hotel room for the night. However, Jay and Tanya decided to save that money and just sleep in the van. Jay's father also gave him a check for $700 to buy the part and a few $100s for other expenses. Despite Seattle being relatively close to Victoria, the couple had to take 2 ferries, first to get into the U.S. and then to cross the bay near Seattle. On the morning of November 18th, The couple got into the van and headed to the first ferry, which would take them to Port Angeles. Their parents expected them to return home the next day in the afternoon, but Tanya and Jay never showed up. Their families began to worry almost immediately, knowing the ferry schedule and realizing that if the couple had taken the ferry, they should have been home by now. However, the parents considered the possibility that Tanya and Jay might have simply decided to explore and enjoy the beautiful sights along the way, causing them to miss the ferry in Port Angeles. As time passed and there was still no sign of them, Tanya's parents called Jay's parents. By the afternoon, they were seriously concerned that something bad had happened. Despite their worries, the family held on to hope that the couple had just decided to extend their trip and continued to wait. Jay and Tanya did not return home by the end of the day, and the next morning their parents went to the police station to file a missing persons report. However, the local police decided there wasn't enough reason to conduct a full search. Tanya was 18 and Jay was 20. There was no direct evidence that they had been harmed or were victims of a crime, so the police assumed the couple had just gone off on an adventure and told their parents to wait a few days. Naturally, they weren't satisfied with this response, but the officers refused to start the search. By that time, Tanya and Jay's parents were completely certain that they wouldn't have just decided to extend their trip for several days. Jay was supposed to do an important job for his father's business, and he had never been so irresponsible before. And if they had indeed decided to extend their trip, they would have at least called their families from a payphone, which were plentiful along their route. Eventually, Tanya's father decided to start the search on his own. First, he and Jay's parents found out that their children never picked up the part in Seattle. The supplier said he had waited for them for several hours, but no one showed up. Next, Tanya's father drove along the route to Seattle, but this didn't yield any results. He found no trace of Tanya, Jay, or their van. Undeterred, he contacted a private company and rented a helicopter with a pilot to survey the area along their route from the air. However, this also led to nothing. Most of the area was covered with dense forests, making it difficult to spot anything. After that, Tanya's father made flyers with information about their disappearance and went to Seattle to post them on the streets. This went on for several days. The families of the missing couple did everything they could to find them, and the local police department finally started taking the case seriously. However, they still believed that Tanya and Jay were just spending time together somewhere and would eventually come home. As a result, they only contacted their colleagues in Seattle, providing a description of the van and information about Tanya and Jay, asking to notify them if anyone spotted them. On November 24th, 5 days after the disappearance, a man went for a walk in the woods near a small town about 90 miles north of Seattle. While walking along the road near an embankment leading into the forest, he noticed something unusual under a tree below. When he took a closer look, he realized it was a human body and immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and discovered the body of a young woman. Her clothes were partially missing, hands were tied, and there was a gunshot wound on her head. Investigators quickly determined that the victim had been killed elsewhere as there was almost no blood near the body. There was no ID on the victim, so the police checked the list of missing women in the area. They quickly concluded that the victim matched the description of Tanya Van Cuylenborg and contacted her father. He went to the morgue and confirmed that the deceased was indeed his daughter. Detectives began their investigation, trying to establish all the details of what had happened. They learned that Tanya had been traveling with Jay, whose whereabouts were still unknown. Jay's van was also missing, leading investigators to consider his possible involvement. Jay's family refused to believe he could have done something like this. They insisted that he had never shown signs of aggression and that he loved Tanya. He also did not own a firearm and would not have been able to purchase one easily. While the police were trying to locate him, they got another call. A bartender from a town called Bellingham, about 18 miles from where the body was found, went outside and saw a wallet and keys on the ground. When he opened the wallet, he found an ID with the name Tanya Van Cuylenborg. At first, he didn't call the police. Instead, he took everything back to the bar, thinking the owner might return for them. But after seeing a news report about Tanya's murder on TV, he immediately called 911. Detectives searched the area around the bar and found several plastic zip ties, identical to those used to bind Tanya's hands under the back porch. They also discovered rubber gloves and a half-empty box of bullets. But that wasn't all. One of the officers noticed a van parked nearby, and the police quickly determined that it was the same vehicle Tanya and Jay had traveled in. Inside the van, there was utter chaos. Everything was scattered and broken, but investigators managed to find several important clues. There were numerous receipts that could help reconstruct Tanya and Jay's route, as well as a ferry ticket. This indicated that the couple had indeed made it to Seattle and something horrible happened to them there. Detectives also noticed that Tanya's camera, which she had taken on the trip, was missing from the van. Since it wasn't found near her body either, they speculated that the killer might have taken it. The interior of the van was covered in blood. Forensic experts collected these samples and sent them to the lab, hoping that this evidence would bring them closer to solving the case. At that time, DNA analysis was just starting to be used in criminology, but it had already helped solve several cases. The lab in Seattle conducted the analysis and found 3 blood samples: Tanya's, Jay's, and an unknown man's. Since the FBI's DNA database did not exist yet, it was impossible to identify the third person without a direct comparison. Nevertheless, detectives realized that Jay was likely not involved in the murder and stopped considering him as the main suspect. They now faced other questions. Was he still alive, and where was he? Unfortunately, it didn't take long to find the answer. On November 26th, a group of friends went hunting just a few dozen miles from Seattle. While walking near a bridge over a small river, they saw a human body in the bushes and reported it to the police. Investigators quickly identified the deceased as Jay Cook. His body showed numerous bruises, and the cause of death appeared to be strangulation. Given the brutality of this crime, detectives even considered that the perpetrator might have known Jay and had some personal motives. They also theorized that Jay had been killed first since his body was found closer to Seattle. The perpetrator then drove Tanya in the van almost to the Canadian border, killed her, left her body in a wooded area. Medical experts also found traces of semen on her body, and DNA analysis revealed that it belonged to the same man whose blood was found in the van. However, his identity remained unknown. At the same time, investigators were trying to reconstruct the couple's route, and the receipts found in the van helped them establish an approximate timeline. After Tanya and Jay took the ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles, they stopped at a store to buy some food. Then, they headed towards Seattle, but Jay apparently missed the turn for the shortest route. This was supported by a receipt from a store in the small town of Hoodsport and the testimony of the store clerk, who saw a young couple matching their description and remembered they asked for directions to the ferry crossing. The clerk also shared an interesting observation. She thought that a man in a brown raincoat was following the couple. He entered the store shortly after them and left right after they did, but she didn't see where the man went next. The next receipt showed detectives that Tanya and Jay had visited a store in the small town of Allen. After that, they reached the ferry near Seattle and bought a ticket. Several witnesses saw them near this location, but detectives couldn't track their movements beyond that point. Investigators began checking various individuals in Seattle who had previous convictions for violent crimes, trying to find suspects. But these efforts yielded no results. Despite having the killer's DNA, the police had no idea how to identify the perpetrator. They suspected this person had committed serious crimes before, as it was hard to believe an amateur could pull off such an elaborate crime. It seemed likely he had followed the couple for a while and managed to abduct them once they reached Seattle. Investigators thought he might have gained their trust by asking for a ride and at some point used a gun to force them to comply with his demands. They also thought that the killer had deliberately left Tanya's belongings and the rubber gloves in a visible place to taunt the police. Perhaps the killer was trying to say that it was useless to search for his fingerprints since he wore gloves and they wouldn't be able to catch him. It's worth mentioning that forensic experts found several fingerprints on the van that did not belong to Tanya or Jay. However, the police doubted they belonged to the killer, given that he likely wore gloves. These prints were not in any databases, so they did not bring investigators any closer to catching the perpetrator. For the next few weeks, detectives continued to search for new leads or witnesses and checked various suspects, But none of these efforts yielded results. This continued until December, about a month after the murders, when something unexpected happened. Tanya and Jay's family started receiving letters and postcards from someone claiming to be the killer. In these messages, the sender confessed to the crimes, mocked the victims' families, and said the police would never catch him. Investigators tried to trace the sender, but this was extremely difficult in those days. All they could determine was which cities the letters were sent from, but this information did not help identify the perpetrator. The letters continued to arrive on a regular basis, often during holidays, which investigators believed was the sender's way of causing the families even more pain. Police also found that the letters were sent from different cities and states, indicating that the sender traveled around the country. However, they weren't entirely sure that the sender was the killer. In high-profile cases, it's not uncommon for people to torment the victims' families with fake letters claiming to be from the perpetrator. Unfortunately, fake letters from supposed perpetrators are a common thing. Since then, there was no significant progress in the case for many years. Detectives continued to investigate potential suspects and did not rule out the involvement of a serial killer. This theory was supported by the fact that 2 other couples had been abducted in the same part of the state in recent years, although the police found the connection between these cases tenuous. In the following years, investigators caught several serial killers operating in the area, but none were linked to the murders of Tanya and Jay. In 2003, the case was reopened and detectives entered the perpetrator's DNA sample into the FBI database, but no matches were found. Despite this, they continued to believe that the perpetrator must have had a lengthy criminal history, but either had not been caught by the police or had been arrested before DNA sampling became mandatory. In 2010, something else happened. This case was featured on a popular national TV program, resulting in numerous fresh tips. One caller suggested that he might know the identity of the person who sent the letters to the victims' families. This lead pointed to a 78-year-old man from Seattle, and the police began investigating him. It turned out that this man had traveled extensively around the country during those years, and the location of his trips matched the cities from which the letters were sent. Detectives concluded that he was indeed the author of these letters but had no connection to the actual murders. This individual clearly suffered from severe mental health issues, and his DNA did not match the blood and semen samples from the crime scenes. This confirmed that the letters were written not by the real perpetrator but by a completely unrelated person. The case remained cold for several more years. In 2018, detectives learned about Parabon, a company offering to create composite sketches of individuals based on their DNA samples. Given the lack of any other leads, investigators decided to try this method. Parabon experts created estimated sketches of the killer at different ages, and the police distributed these images to the media, hoping someone might recognize the man. However, it led nowhere. Despite this, the investigators refused to give up and decided to try another method, genetic genealogy. Parabot experts uploaded the killer's DNA sample to public databases and began searching for any distant relatives of the perpetrator. Soon, they identified a possible second cousin of the killer and started tracing her family tree. They were searching for a man who lived in Seattle or its vicinity in 1987 and matched all the criteria, including age. With the help of his cousin, they eventually identified their suspect, a 55-year-old man named William Talbot. He lived in a Seattle suburb and worked as a truck driver. Before they could arrest him, police needed to confirm that the killer's DNA matched his. They surveilled William for a couple of days and eventually retrieved a coffee cup he had discarded. The saliva sample from the cup provided a DNA profile that was a perfect match. In mid-May 2018, 30 years after the murders, investigators finally arrested William, denied any involvement, and the case went to court. The trial began in 2019 and the defense attorneys tried to challenge the primary evidence, the DNA. They argued that the semen on Tanya's body could have resulted from consensual intercourse. They also pointed out that the prosecution had no other evidence directly linking William to Jay's murder. However, the prosecutor had a strong counterargument. As we remember, back in 1987, experts found fingerprints on the van that did not match Tanya or Jay, nor did they match anyone in the database at the time. Now, experts compared these fingerprints to William's and they were a match. Another crucial piece of evidence came from William's friend. He testified that he saw a brown van outside Williams in 1987, which clearly didn't belong to him. This suggested that William might have driven the van to his house, although it was unclear whether this was before or after the murders. William also lived only a few miles from where Jay's body was found, indicating he was familiar with the area. None of William's relatives attended the trial, but they did share quite a bit with the investigators. They described William as always being very aggressive, and other family members were genuinely afraid of him. Because of this, most had cut off contact with him after he had moved out. When they learned about the charges against him, none were surprised that William could have committed such crimes. The prosecution's theory was that William had asked Tanya and Jay for a ride to Seattle under some pretext. Once they arrived in the city at night, he used a gun to force them to drive to a remote area. He then killed them at different locations, discarded Tanya's belongings and the van in another town, and remained off the police radar for the next 30 years. Without a confession, it was impossible to establish more details, but with such substantial evidence, no one doubted Williams' guilt. The trial ended in June 2019, and Williams was found guilty of the double murder. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Notably, this was the first case where genetic genealogy led to a conviction. However, an unexpected problem arose after the trial. Williams' lawyers appealed the conviction, arguing that the jury had been biased against the defendant, which they claimed violated his constitutional rights and made the jurors unfit to serve. This led to a judge overturning the conviction in 2021, granting William the right to a retrial. However, in 2022, a higher court reversed this decision, upholding the original conviction. As for Williams' potential involvement in other crimes, there is still no clarity. He had previous convictions for minor and medium offenses but had never been charged with murder. Investigators still believe William may be linked to other unsolved cases because the murder of Tanya and Jay did not seem like the work of an amateur. The way he executed the crime and evaded justice for decades indicated he might have killed before. But we may never learn the truth. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section. And don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.